Welcome to the Profiling Predicament. Tonight we delve into a profoundly challenging question. Is criminal profiling inherently biased by race? This isn't merely an academic debate. The implications touch upon the very foundations of justice, the efficacy of law enforcement, and the pursuit of societal equity. We are joined by two distinguished experts who bring vastly different perspectives to this complex issue. Professor Kenji Tanaka, a renowned professor of criminology and sociology, argues that racial bias is deeply embedded within the practice of profiling. And Agent Isabella Rossi, a senior behavioral analyst with extensive field experience, posits that professional profiling focuses on behavioral science, striving to mitigate bias. We will begin with opening statements, followed by structured discussion rounds, and conclude with closing remarks. Professor Tanaka, would you please begin?
Thank you, Dr. Reed. The assertion that criminal profiling can be neatly disentangled from racial bias is, I contend, a dangerous fiction. At its core, criminal profiling, particularly in its historical evolution, is inextricably linked to prejudiced ideologies, echoing outdated concepts like physiognomy, which sought to link physical traits, often racialized, to criminality. While modern practitioners might claim a focus on behavior, the bedrock upon which many profiles are built is statistical data, arrest rates, conviction patterns, data which is itself profoundly skewed. This data reflects decades, indeed centuries, of systemic biases in policing, judicial processes, and societal structures that disproportionately target and criminalize racial minorities. Therefore, when a profile incorporates statistical likelihoods based on this compromised data, it inevitably perpetuates and amplifies existing racial disparities. Consider the historical application. Practices resembling profiling have repeatedly led to discriminatory outcomes, such as disproportionate stop-and-frisk actions against minority communities, often justified by vague suspect descriptions that align with racial stereotypes embedded in the data. Even if a profile purports to be race-neutral, focusing solely on, quote, behavioral patterns, we cannot ignore the pervasive influence of cognitive biases. Implicit bias, often unconscious, shapes how investigators interpret behaviors, select salient details, and ultimately construct and apply a profile within a societal context already saturated with racial preconceptions. The very act of predicting criminality based on group characteristics, even behavioral ones derived from biased data, risks reinforcing harmful stereotypes. Therefore, I maintain that the methodology's reliance on flawed data sources and its susceptibility to human bias make racial prejudice an inherent, unavoidable feature of criminal profiling, as it is often practiced.
Thank you, Professor Tanaka, for that compelling opening statement. Agent Rossi, we now turn to you for your perspective.
Thank you, Dr. Reed. Professor Tanaka raises crucial points about historical context and the undeniable reality of systemic bias, which we must always confront. However, I must firmly distinguish between the rigorous discipline of modern professional behavioral analysis and the crude racial stereotyping he describes. Contemporary criminal profiling, or more accurately, behavioral investigative analysis, is not about predicting criminality based on race. It is the meticulous analysis of crime scene evidence, victimology, geography, and specific behavioral patterns exhibited during the commission of a crime. The objective is to infer characteristics of an unknown offender, their habits, level of organization, potential motives, psychological state, and behavioral tendencies, directly from the evidence left behind. I absolutely acknowledge that profiling has been misused historically, and the potential for bias exists if protocols are ignored or if individuals engage in unprofessional conduct. Vigilance is non-negotiable. However, the core methodology focuses intensely on asterisk behavioral consistency, what the offender did, how they did it, modus operandi, and potentially why they did it. Signature aspects. Race is not treated as a behavioral predictor. If a witness provides a racial descriptor, it's noted as part of the overall information, but it doesn't form the foundation of the behavioral analysis. The analysis rests on actions, not assumptions based on group identity. Within specialized units, extensive training, adherence to strict ethical guidelines, peer review, and supervisory oversight are specifically designed to mitigate personal and systemic biases. We emphasize deductive profiling, reasoning directly from the evidence of a specific crime, rather than relying solely on inductive methods, which generalize from group statistics and carry a higher risk of incorporating stereotype. While the justice system at large faces profound challenges regarding bias, the tool of behavioral analysis itself, when employed with the requisite rigor, ethics, and focus on evidence, is not inherently race-based. It is a tool to understand criminal behavior, not prejudge individuals based on race.
Thank you both for clearly outlining your positions. Let's delve deeper into the methodology and data. Professor Tanaka argues the foundational data is inherently skewed by systemic racism. Agent Rossi emphasizes a focus on behavioral science derived from crime scene evidence. Agent Rossi, how does modern profiling practically avoid incorporating racially biased statistical data, especially when patterns might seem to emerge? And Professor Tanaka, can behavioral analysis truly be hermetically sealed from the biased societal and institutional context in which it operates?
Certainly. The avoidance of biased statistical reliance comes from grounding the analysis firmly in the specifics of the time a case at hand asterisk. We look at indicators like the level of planning versus impulsivity, the methods used to control the victim, the types of weapons employed, the sequence of actions, any evidence of ritualistic behavior, and the geographical pattern of offenses. These are behavioral and psychological footprints. For instance, analyzing whether a crime scene is organized or disorganized provides insights into the offender's potential state of mind, cognitive abilities, and lifestyle characteristics independent of race. If statistical data on offender demographics is consulted at all, it's typically used cautiously, late in the process, perhaps to consider base rates, but never as a substitute for case-specific behavioral evidence. The primary data source is the crime itself. Furthermore, data integrity is crucial. We strive to use information verified through investigation, not just raw arrest statistics. If race is mentioned by a witness, it's documented, but the profile focuses on actionable behaviors, not demographic probabilities, derived from potentially biased aggregate data.
Agent Rossi presents an idealized picture, Dr. Reed. The notion that behavioral interpretation can be entirely objective, divorced from context, is highly questionable. Who interprets these behavioral footprints? Human beings, analysts and investigators operating within institutional cultures that are themselves influenced by societal biases, including racial stereotypes. How is organized versus disorganized behavior interpreted? Might stereotypes unconsciously influence whether certain behaviors are attributed to sophisticated planning versus impulsive violence depending on preconceived notions about different racial groups? Moreover, where do the baseline understandings of typical criminal behavior patterns originate? Often, they are developed through studying known offenders, individuals apprehended and convicted within the very justice system we've identified as systemically biased. If the pool of known offenders used to develop these behavioral models is already skewed by discriminatory policing and prosecution, then the models themselves risk embedding those biases, even if they appear race-neutral on the surface. You cannot simply extract behavior from its socio-historical context and the bias systems that record and interpret it. The lens of interpretation is invariably colored.
Professor, I concur that bias is a persistent threat requiring constant mitigation, which is why rigorous training, peer review, and adherence to methodology are paramount. We are trained to challenge our assumptions and focus explicitly on evidence-based inferences. The interpretation of behaviors like organization isn't arbitrary. It's linked to specific crime scene indicators, presence or absence of restraints, efforts to conceal the body, evidence of surveillance. These are concrete details, not abstract judgments, easily swayed by stereotype if discipline is maintained. While acknowledging the system's flaws, behavioral analysis focuses on the how and why of the specific crime, seeking patterns that transcend simplistic demographic categorization. It's about understanding the individual offender's unique psychological signature through their actions.
Yet, the potential for misinterpretation remains significant. Implicit bias studies consistently show that even well-intentioned individuals hold unconscious biases that can affect judgment, particularly under pressure or when dealing with ambiguous information, which is common in complex investigations. Relying on individual discipline within a flawed system seems an insufficient safeguard against the potential for profiling, however sophisticated, to disproportionately scrutinize and harm minority communities.
This brings us to the critical issue of impact and accountability. Considering the potential harm of misidentification or biased application, weighed against the claimed investigative benefits, what are the tangible consequences? Professor Tanaka, you've alluded to harms. Could you elaborate? And Agent Rossi, how is accountability ensured when profiles are used? And are there truly no viable alternatives or essential reforms needed?
The real-world consequences are severe and deeply corrosive. When profiles, influenced by racial bias, guide investigations, innocent individuals, disproportionately from minority groups, face wrongful suspicion, invasive questioning, and even arrest. This isn't just an inconvenience. It's a traumatic experience that can shatter lives and livelihoods. It breeds profound mistrust between communities and law enforcement, making future cooperation less likely. Furthermore, it perpetuates harmful stereotypes, reinforcing the societal association of certain racial groups with criminality. The psychological toll on entire communities subjected to this kind of suspicion is immeasurable. Given this high potential for error and devastating impact, I argue the purported utility of profiling is often overstated and outweighed by the risks. Resources would be far better invested in addressing the socio-economic root causes of crime, fostering community policing initiatives built on trust, and adhering strictly to evidence-based investigative methods that focus on concrete leads, not predictive profiles. Accountability is often lacking. The internal reviews Agent Rossi mentioned can be opaque, and legal challenges are difficult. We need a fundamental shift away from these predictive techniques towards justice grounded in equality and tangible proof.
Professor Tanaka rightly highlights the devastating impact of wrongful actions within the justice system, and accountability is indeed crucial. However, attributing these harms solely or primarily to the methodology of behavioral analysis misrepresents its role. A profile is an investigative tool, not evidence in itself. It's intended to help focus investigations, particularly in complex, often serial cases where leads are scarce. Consider cases involving serial offenders where behavioral analysis helped identify crucial patterns: victim selection, geographic movement, escalating violence, allowing investigators to narrow vast suspect pools and allocate resources effectively, potentially preventing further crimes. In a series of assaults with unique ritualistic elements, understanding the behavior's psychological significance, not the offender's race, might point towards specific occupational groups or personality types, guiding the investigation productively. Accountability exists through several layers. Internal agency policies demand justification for investigative steps. Profiles are subject to scrutiny and require corroborating evidence before leading to arrests or warrants. Legal frameworks like Dober standards challenge the scientific validity of techniques used in court. Continuous training emphasizes ethical considerations and bias awareness. The solution isn't to discard a potentially valuable tool, but to refine it, enhance oversight, ensure transparency, and demand rigorous adherence to evidence-based behavioral principles, completely divorced from racial prejudice. While systemic issues need addressing, behavioral analysis, used correctly, aids investigations based on what offenders do, not who they are assumed to be based on race.
These safeguards sound reassuring in theory, Agent Rossi, but practice often falls short. The quote, corroborating evidence sought might itself be gathered through confirmation bias, where investigators unconsciously seek evidence matching the profile. The line between using a profile to focus an investigation and using it to justify disproportionate scrutiny of a particular demographic, often racial, can be perilously thin, especially when implicit biases are at play. The utility in a few complex cases cannot justify the systemic risk and the documented instances of racial bias creeping into its application. Reform is insufficient. We need alternatives.
The risk of confirmation bias exists in all investigations, Professor, which is why robust procedures and critical review are essential across the board, not just concerning profiling. It's a challenge inherent in human investigation, not solely tied to this specific tool. To discard behavioral analysis entirely would be to ignore decades of development and understanding criminal psychology and behavior, potentially hindering complex investigations where such insights are indispensable. Refinement, transparency, and rigorous oversight are the responsible path forward.
We are nearing the end of our discussion. I'd like to give each of you a moment for a brief closing statement. Professor Tanaka, please proceed.
Thank you. Throughout this discussion, I have maintained that criminal profiling, despite claims of scientific objectivity, remains fundamentally entangled with racial bias. Its historical origins are rooted in prejudice. Its methodologies often rely on data reflecting systemic discrimination, and its application is vulnerable to the pervasive influence of cognitive biases within our society and institutions. The consequence is a practice that too often directs disproportionate suspicion towards marginalized communities, undermining trust and perpetuating injustice. True progress lies not in attempting to sanitize a flawed tool, but in dismantling biased systems and embracing equitable, evidence-based approaches that respect the rights and dignity of all individuals, irrespective of race.
Thank you, Professor Tanaka. Agent Rossi, your closing statement?
Thank you, Dr. Reed. I reiterate that professional behavioral analysis is a specialized investigative methodology focused on deciphering criminal actions and motivations from crime scene evidence. It must be rigorously distinguished from simplistic, unacceptable racial stereotyping. When applied ethically and competently, its primary inputs are behavioral data, not racial assumptions. While acknowledging the absolute necessity for vigilance against bias at every level of the justice system, and the reality of historical missteps, the methodology itself is not inherently racist. It is a valuable tool for complex cases that requires continuous refinement, stringent oversight, and unwavering commitment to ethical practice, ensuring it serves justice by focusing on evidence, not prejudice.
Professor Kenji Tanaka, Agent Isabella Rossi, thank you both for sharing your expertise and engaging in this critical, nuanced discussion at such a high level. Tonight's debate highlights a central tension. Is criminal profiling an investigative tool requiring stringent safeguards against bias, or is it a practice so inherently problematic that its use perpetuates racial inequity? We leave our audience with much to consider. Thank you for watching the Profile